The other day, I was speaking to a very dear friend of mine about race issues in America. My friend happens to be white. She asked me what percentage of black people would likely hold her personally responsible for slavery. I told her that I could not quantify a percentage, but likely many African Americans would hold her personally responsible for the sins of her ancestors because of news reports like this.
A New York Times Magazine article out today that makes a detailed argument for reparations, payments of money to the descendants of enslaved people.
If there ever were a time to take seriously transformative racial change, this would be now.
Nicole Hannah-Jones is a Pulitzer Prize-winning correspondent. She says the federal government has made enormous payments to white people historically.
It decides to start giving 160-acre tracts of land to white Americans, including white people who were white Europeans that the government wanted to attract to immigrate to the United States.
That was the Homestead Act of the mid-1800s to early 1900s that benefits some 46 million white descendants of homesteaders, she says. Also,
there's been restitution paid to some indigenous tribes for the theft of their land. There's been restitution paid to Japanese survivors of internment camps. So we understand the idea of restitution. We even pay money to Holocaust survivors, and we didn't commit that crime. We do that because it is the moral thing to do.
Now, I've heard several arguments made for reparations on numerous occasions, but I tend to reject them. Why? Well, for me, it always comes down to this basic question. Who should pay? I'll explain what I mean after this word from my sponsor.
This podcast is brought to you by Black History Quiz because it takes more than a month to learn our history. History is not black and white. It's complicated. America was built on slave labor, yet blacks owned slaves as well. The Republican Party was founded to abolish slavery, but today most blacks vote Democrat. And sometimes, just sometimes, African kings marry white. No matter the race, people are complicated, filled with contradictions, and change with the times. To view history through the lenses of today's culture cheats the learner of the full story. Black History Quiz is a newsletter that shares facts you might not have learned in school and certainly did not learn from mainstream media. Black History Quiz educates, sparks debate, and often puts history in a brand new light. Visit blackhistoryquiz.com and subscribe to the weekly newsletter. No matter your perspective of history, you will not be disappointed. blackhistoryquiz.com.
The topic of reparations for African Americans is a topic that has been discussed ad nauseum and typically for political advantage. Case in point, here's a quote from the Washington Times. The headline reads, "California moves to consider reparations for slavery." The date of the article is August 29th, 2020. California lawmakers are setting up a task force to study and make recommendations for reparations to African Americans, particularly the descendants of slaves, as the nation struggles again with civil rights and unrest following the latest shooting of a black man by police. The state Senate supported creating the 9-member commission on a bipartisan 33-3 vote Saturday. The measure returns to the Assembly for a final vote before lawmakers adjourn for the year on Monday, though Assembly members overwhelmingly already approved an earlier version of the bill. Let's be clear. Chattel slavery, both in California and across our nation, birthed a legacy of racial harm and inequity that continues to impact the conditions of black life in California, said Democratic Senator Holly Mitchell of Los Angeles. She cited disproportionate homelessness, unemployment, involvement in the criminal justice system, lower academic performance, and higher health risks during the coronavirus pandemic. Although California, before the Civil War, was officially a free state, Mitchell listed legal and judicial steps state officials took at the time to support slavery in southern states while repressing blacks. The legislation would require the task force to conduct a detailed study of the impact of slavery in California and recommend to the legislature by July 2023 the form of compensation that should be awarded, how it should be awarded, and who should be eligible for compensation. The panel, which would start meeting no later than June 2021, could also recommend other forms of rehabilitation. A sober-minded person might ask, what does slavery that happened centuries ago have to do with today's homelessness, unemployment, health risks associated with the coronavirus, and all the other social issues mentioned in that quote? Outside of inciting the passions of would-be voters, what immediate benefit does it provide to the people of California? When reparations are discussed, it is typically proposed that the U.S. government should be paying African Americans an undetermined amount of money for the suffering inflicted upon their ancestors by all the white people in America. If we look at this logically and without angry rhetoric, that argument doesn't hold up to scrutiny. To illustrate that, let me share with you some inconvenient facts. Inconvenient fact number 1. Very few white people in America owned slaves. According to data on white slave owners from a U.S. Census Bureau 1860 report, only 1.6% of whites in America owned slaves. I'll quote that number again. 1.6% of whites in America owned slaves. Again, according to an 1860 U.S. Census Bureau report. Between 1525 and 1866, in the entire history of the slave trade to the New World, according to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, 12.5 million Africans were shipped to the New World. 10.7 million survived the dreaded Middle Passage, disembarking in North America, the Caribbean, and South America. And how many of these 10.7 million Africans were shipped directly to North America? Only about 388,000. In other words, 4% of slaves from Africa went to North America. The other 96% went to South America. Inconvenient fact number 2. Native Americans owned and traded in slaves. According to the Oklahoma Historical Society website and Smithsonian Magazine, from the late 18th century on, Native Americans in the South, like whites, owned slaves. And when the U.S. government removed the 5 nations to Indian Territory, now the state of Oklahoma, in the 1830s, they took their slaves with them, so that by the time the Civil War broke out, more than 8,000 blacks were enslaved in Indian Territory. Overall, enslaved people accounted for 14% of the population of the Indian Territory, and it wasn't until after the Civil War that emancipation arrived for some of their slaves. Inconvenient fact number 3. African Americans owned slaves too. In the essay, The Known World of Free Black Slaveholders, a research note on the scholarship of Carter G. Woodson, Thomas Presley uses the research of Carter G. Woodson to state the following. In 1830, there were about 320,000 free blacks in America. Out of that 320,000 free blacks, roughly 4,000 owned 12,900 slaves. Presley breaks it down further to say, 1% of black slave owners in 1830 owned between 20 and 84 slaves. 4% owned between 10 to 19 slaves, and 94% owned 1 to 9 slaves. And 42% owned just 1 slave. So, Should white people today be forced to pay reparations when only 1.6% of whites in America during the slavery era owned slaves? Should we demand payment from Native Americans and African Americans as well? Because both groups owned African American slaves too. I could go on, but no, I'll go on. I'll share one more inconvenient fact. Inconvenient fact number 4. Whites were slaves in North Africa before blacks were slaves in America. I am quoting a 2004 article now from Ohio State News. A new study suggests that 1 million or more European Christians were enslaved by Muslims between 1530 and 1780, a far greater number than had ever been estimated before. In a new book, Robert Davis, professor of history at Ohio State University, developed a unique methodology to calculate the number of white Christians who were enslaved along Africa's Barbary coast, arriving at much higher slave population estimates than any previous study had found. Most other accounts of slavery along the Barbary coast didn't try to estimate the number of slaves or only looked at the number of slaves in particular cities, Davis said. Most previously estimated slave counts have thus tended to be in the thousands or at the most in the tens of thousands. Davis, by contrast, has calculated that between 1 million and 1.25 million European Christians were captured and forced to work in North Africa from the 16th to 18th centuries. Davis's new estimates appear in the book Christian Slaves, Muslim Masters, White Slavery in the Mediterranean, the Barbary Coast, and Italy. Now, in light of that, should today's white people demand reparation from today's black people for the crime of enslaving their ancestors for 2 centuries? For some reason, lack of education mostly, so many people in America believe that America created the institution of slavery. I assure you, America did not invent slavery. A cursory glance into a Bible proves that. But I digress because I'm veering off from something I really want to express in 3 points. Point number 1. The reparations agreement between Israel and the Federal Republic of Germany was signed on September 10, 1952, and entered in force on March 27, 1953. According to the agreement, West Germany was to pay Israel for the cost of resettling so great a number of uprooted and destitute Jewish refugees after the war, and to compensate individual Jews via the Conference on Jewish Material Claims against Germany for losses in Jewish livelihood and property resulting from Nazi persecution. That was justice and the right. Point number 2. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt forced Japanese Americans to be relocated and incarcerated in concentration camps. There was no justification for this strategy, and later research proved it was motivated by fear and racism. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed into law the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which apologized for the internment on behalf of the U.S. government and authorized a payment of $20,000 to each former internee who was still alive when the act was passed, a total cost of $1.6 billion. That was justice and the right thing to do. Point number 3. Reparations were paid to Jewish and Japanese survivors because they were personally affected by the trauma. So, should African Americans be paid reparations? The direct survivors of slavery who were personally traumatized centuries ago should have been, but not the African Americans of today, because who can truly know who owes what? Statistically speaking, very few whites enslaved black people, again 1.6. Native Americans enslaved black people enslaved black people, and blacks enslaved white people for 2 centuries. So again, who pays? Now, no doubt some of you listening will have a problem with what I said. Perhaps you're already calling me names right now as you're listening. If so, I want to leave you with one final quote where a certain group is demanding social justice because of slavery. The West is being asked to pay Africa $777 trillion within 5 years in reparation for enslaving Africans while colonizing the continent. The African World Reparations and Repatriation Truth Commission, meeting in Accra for its first international conference, also called for all international debt owed by Africa to be unconditionally canceled. The Accra Declaration issued at the conference says that money will be demanded from all those nations of Western Europe and the Americas and institutions who participated and benefited from the slave trade and colonialism. The conference, co-chaired by Dr. Hamid Malana and Mrs. Deborah Kofi, announced plans to set up an international team of lawyers from Africa and the diaspora to pursue all legal means to collect the money. The group will also be contacting the International Court of Justice as well as the United Nations and the Organization of African Unity for assistance. Mrs. Kofi told the BBC the reparations figure was based on the number of human lives lost to Africa during the slave trade, as well as an assessment of the worth of the gold, diamonds, and other minerals taken from the continent during colonial rule. She says Africa's turn has come. We are the only group that have not received reparations. The Jewish people have received reparations. The Native Americans have received reparations. The Korean comfort women, and so on and so forth, she said. The declaration added that all those in the diaspora who want to return and settle in Africa should be allowed to do so, and that those who enslaved and colonized Africa should provide seaworthy vessels and aircraft for such repatriation. The date of that article from BBC News is August 20th.
You have been listening to the Things I Think About podcast. If you love what you heard, hate what you heard, or don't know what you just heard, I want to know about it. Drop me an email. I can be reached at Jim Stroud, that's JIMSTROUD, @jimstroud.com. So, until next time, bye-bye.